Welcome to Sleepy Nights, a place where imagination and mystery intertwine, guiding you into a world of wonder and rest. As we journey together, let the soothing sound of the rain and the calming rhythm of my voice carry you closer to a peaceful slumber. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating these stories that ease your mind and lull you to sleep. Now, settle in, relax, and let your thoughts drift away. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the sharp sting of bleach or the acrid tang of smoke. No, this was subtler, stranger, a faint, sweet aroma like decaying flowers. It lingered in the air, clinging to the walls of the abandoned house where the missing child's bicycle was found. I had been a detective for over a decade, and in that time, I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. But as I stepped further into that house, the unease in my chest felt new. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance. The house was eerily empty, save for the bike and something else. A small black card lying neatly on the seat. I picked up the card with gloved hands, my stomach tightening as I read the words scrawled in delicate silvery ink. 1 gone, 5 to go. Beneath the words was a symbol, a jagged triangle with an eye at its center. Detective, you might want to see this. The voice of Officer Haynes, my partner, cut through the heavy silence. He stood in the doorway of a side room, his flashlight illuminating a wall covered in photos. Each one was of children, all around the same age, their faces frozen in innocent smiles. My gut twisted as I realized the child whose bike we had found wasn't the first to disappear. The next few days were a blur of interviews, reports, and dead ends. The missing child, 8-year-old Daniel Gray, had vanished from his front yard 2 days earlier. His parents were distraught, their grief raw and consuming. But it was the calling card that haunted me. I had sent it to forensics, hoping for prints or fibers, anything that could give us a lead. But the report came back clean. No fingerprints, no DNA, no identifiable ink or paper source. 2 days later, another child vanished. This time, the scene was a playground. The swings still moved in the evening breeze, but the laughter that usually filled the air was replaced by the sound of sobbing parents and police radios. And there it was again, a black card left on the seat of the merry-go-round. 2 gone, 4 to go. The symbol was different this time, a crescent moon with jagged edges. The cards became my obsession. Each new disappearance brought another card, each one bearing a new symbol and a new message. 3 gone, 3 to go. 4 gone, 2 to go. Each time, the location seemed random. A grocery store parking lot, a quiet cul-de-sac, a carnival. The only connection was the age of the victims, children between 7 and 10 years old. I combed through every database, searching for similar cases, but nothing matched. It was as if the kidnapper was creating their own sick game, and I was the unwilling player. The breakthrough came late one night, as I sat in my dimly lit office, staring at the cards spread across my desk. The symbols seemed familiar, but I couldn't place them. Frustrated, I grabbed my phone and began searching for anything that could match. That's when I found it, a reference to an ancient code used by secret societies. The symbols on the cards were part of a ritual, each one representing a step in a process. And the messages, they weren't just taunts, they were a countdown. I brought my findings to Haynes the next morning. "Whoever's doing this isn't just kidnapping kids," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "They're following some kind of ritual, and if we don't stop them before they reach the final step..." I didn't need to finish the sentence. The grim look on Haynes's face said it all. We doubled our efforts, scouring the city for any lead. Surveillance footage, witness statements, even psychics. Nothing was off the table. but it felt like the kidnapper was always one step ahead, leaving us scrambling in their wake. Then came the fifth card. 5 gone, 1 to go. This time, the symbol was a circle with flames radiating from its edges. The sixth disappearance happened on a rainy night. The victim was a 10-year-old girl named Erica, last seen leaving her piano lesson. I arrived at the scene just as her distraught mother was being consoled by officers. The rain soaked through my coat as I approached the spot where Erica's music books lay scattered on the ground. And there it was, the final card. 6 gone. Now it begins. This time, there was no symbol, only a crude map drawn in the same silvery ink. It led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The air inside the warehouse was damp and cold, the faint smell of rust and decay filling my nostrils. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty shelves and broken machinery. "Detective, over here!" Haynes's voice echoed from the far end of the building. I hurried to his side, my heart pounding. He stood in front of a large circular altar made of stone, its surface etched with the same symbols from the cards. In the center of the altar was a small, black book. I picked it up carefully, flipping through its brittle pages. It was a diary, detailing a ritual meant to summon something. The final page was blank, save for 2 chilling words. "It's done." We never found the children. The warehouse yielded no other evidence, and the diary provided no concrete answers. The cards stopped appearing, and the case went cold. But I couldn't let it go. The symbols, the ritual, the countdown, it all stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Sometimes I swear I can hear the faint laughter of children in the distance. And when I close my eyes, I see the cards, their symbols glowing like embers in the dark. Whatever happened to those kids, one thing is certain. The game wasn't meant to end. It was meant to begin. My name is Detective Marcus Reed. I've been with the force for almost 15 years, most of that time spent chasing shadows in the cold case unit. It's a job that requires patience, persistence, and, on occasion, a healthy dose of stubbornness. But even with all my experience, nothing could have prepared me for the mystery of Detective Alan Burke. It started with an old case file, one that should have been routine, like countless others. The case itself wasn't particularly unusual on the surface. A missing girl, last seen leaving her apartment complex on a cold November night 5 years ago. Her name was Rachel Calloway, age 22. Her car was found abandoned 2 miles from her home, keys still in the ignition. No sign of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. When the file landed on my desk, it came with an unusual note scrawled in red pen on the first page. "Find Burke." At first, I thought it was a mistake. Alan Burke was a decorated detective, one of the department's finest, before he abruptly vanished 3 years ago. His disappearance had been an open wound for the precinct, a source of whispered theories and lingering guilt. Officially, his case had gone cold, much like the one I was now assigned. But as I read through the Calloway file, a strange pattern began to emerge. Burke had been the lead investigator on Rachel's case before he disappeared. The air in my office felt heavier that evening, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the walls. I spread out the case materials on my desk, photos, interviews, evidence logs, searching for something, anything, that might tie Rachel's disappearance to Burke's. The deeper I dug, the more questions I uncovered. Burke's notes were meticulous, but incomplete, as if he had stopped mid-thought. There were scribbles in the margins, words like watching and don't trust, that hinted at his growing paranoia. And then there was the map. Folded neatly at the back of the file, it was marked with red X's, each one representing a location Burke had visited during his investigation. One of the X's was circled, with the words, "It starts here," written in the same red ink as the note on the file. I decided to start there, The circled location was an old rundown motel on the outskirts of town. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The motel looked like it hadn't seen a paying customer in decades. The windows were boarded up, the neon sign flickered weakly, and the parking lot was overgrown with weeds. The owner, a wiry man with a cigarette permanently affixed to his lips, was less than helpful. "Burke?" he repeated when I showed him the photo. "Yeah, I remember him. Came here asking about some girl. Never saw him again after that." When I pressed him for more details, he shrugged. "Check room 8, he said. That's where he spent most of his time." Room 8 was at the end of the hall, the door hanging slightly ajar. The stench of mildew hit me as I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, save for a battered desk and a single chair. But it wasn't until I opened the desk drawer that I found something chilling. Burke's badge. Holding Burke's badge in my hand, I felt a strange mix of emotions: curiosity, dread, and a gnawing sense of inevitability. It was as if the missing detective had left it there for me to find, a breadcrumb in a trail that had long gone cold. The badge wasn't the only thing in the drawer. There was also a small notebook filled with cryptic notes. "She knows. They're watching. It's not what it seems." The last entry sent a chill down my spine. "If you're reading this, it's already too late." Back at the station, I pored over Burke's notes, trying to make sense of his ramblings. One name kept appearing: James Holloway. A quick search revealed that Holloway had been a suspect in Rachel's disappearance, though nothing concrete ever tied him to the crime. I decided to pay Holloway a visit. His house was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where the lawns were meticulously trimmed, and the curtains always seemed to be drawn. When he opened the door, his expression was one of mild annoyance. "Detective?" he said, leaning against the door frame. "What can I do for you?" I kept it professional, asking him about Rachel, about Burke, about anything that might connect him to their disappearances. But his answers were evasive, his tone dripping with condescension. As I turned to leave, he called after me. "Be careful, detective," he said, a sly smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." The next few days were a whirlwind of dead ends and eerie coincidences. Holloway's name came up again and again, but I couldn't find any solid evidence linking him to the case. Meanwhile, I started noticing strange things. My desk drawer left slightly open, my car door unlocked when I knew I had locked it. And then there were the dreams. They started as fragments, flashes of Rachel's face, Burke's badge, and the motel room. But they grew more vivid, more unsettling, until I could feel the weight of someone watching me even when I was awake. It wasn't until I returned to the motel that I found the final piece of the puzzle. In the room next to Burke's, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was a cassette tape. The label read, "For the next one." I played the tape in my car, the sound crackling with age. Burke's voice came through, shaky and strained. "They're everywhere," he said. "It's not just Rachel, it's all of them. And if you're hearing this, you're already part of it." The next day, I went to confront Holloway, but his house was empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no trace that anyone had ever lived there. As I drove back to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the air growing colder. And when I arrived home that night, there was a single piece of paper taped to my front door. "Find Burke." It was then I realized the truth. The case wasn't just about Rachel or Burke, it was about me, and the game was far from over. The call came in just past midnight, as I was nursing the remnants of a cold cup of coffee and contemplating the case files stacked high on my desk. Detective work in a small town often bordered on the mundane. Missing pets, small-time break-ins, the occasional bar fight gone too far. But this call was different. "A bride?" I asked, already scribbling notes. "Missing on her wedding day?" "Yes," the voice on the other end replied, strained and shaky. "At the church. She was there one moment, gone the next. It's like she vanished into thin air." By the time I arrived at the small, whitewashed church on the outskirts of town, the place was a hive of frantic activity. The groom, a young man named Mark Andrews, was pacing the aisle, his face pale as a ghost. His tuxedo was immaculate, but the carnation pinned to his lapel hung limp, as if mirroring his despair. The guests lingered in the pews, whispering in hushed tones. The air was thick with unease, and the faint scent of lilies, the bride's chosen flower, I later learned, clung to the air like a ghostly presence. The priest, Father Jacobs, approached me. His face was lined with worry. "Detective," he said in a hushed tone, "I've officiated dozens of weddings, but I've never seen anything like this. One moment, she was standing at the altar, and the next..." He gestured vaguely toward the doors of the church. I pulled Mark aside, trying to calm his nerves enough to get a coherent statement. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the glow of the lighter briefly illuminating the dark circles under his eyes. "She was perfect," he said, his voice breaking. "Her dress, her smile, everything. We were standing there about to exchange vows. She looked at me and I swear..." He paused, struggling for words. "She looked scared, like she'd seen something behind me." "What happened then?" I asked, leaning forward. "She whispered something. I couldn't hear it. Then she turned and ran, out the side door. No one could catch her." The side door led to a sprawling garden, its hedges neatly trimmed and its pathways lined with flickering lanterns. It should have been romantic, but under the cold moonlight, it felt oppressive. The shadows stretched long and dark, as if hiding secrets. We found her shoes abandoned near the fountain, the delicate white heels tipped on their sides, as though she'd discarded them in a hurry. The ground was damp from a light rain earlier in the day, and faint footprints led away from the church. Bare feet. But they didn't lead to the parking lot, or toward town. They led into the woods. The woods behind the church were dense and unwelcoming, the kind of place that seemed to swallow sound. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled branches that clawed at the sky. The further we went, the quieter it became, until even the rustle of leaves seemed to hold its breath. Mark insisted on coming with me, though he was visibly shaken. "She's in there," he muttered, almost to himself. "She's in there somewhere." We followed the footprints as far as we could, but they ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old well, its stones moss-covered and crumbling. The well looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but something about it felt wrong. Mark froze when he saw it, his face going even paler. "She used to talk about this place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said she used to come here as a kid. Said it felt like it was calling to her." I peered into the darkness of the well, my flashlight revealing nothing but an abyss. Then I saw it. A scrap of white fabric caught on the stones, fluttering gently in the breeze. It matched the bride's dress. Back at the church, I began piecing together what little evidence we had. The dress, her shoes, and now the fabric from the well. It didn't add up. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses beyond the cryptic accounts from the ceremony. I spoke to her parents, who were inconsolable but cooperative. They told me her name was Emily Carter, and she'd been ecstatic about the wedding. At least, that's what they thought. But when I asked about her childhood, their expressions darkened. She was always a little different, her mother admitted. She had these dreams, nightmares really, about someone waiting for her in the woods. She said they promised her something. We thought she'd grown out of it. The revelation. The turning point came when I found Emily's journal. It was hidden in her dressing room, tucked beneath a pile of lace and silk. The entries started out cheerful. filled with excitement about the wedding, but as I flipped through the pages, the tone grew darker. He's still there, waiting. I thought I could escape, but I can feel him watching me. I thought Mark could protect me, but he doesn't understand. No one does. I have to go back. I have to finish what I started. The last entry was dated the night before the wedding. The return. I couldn't shake the feeling that the well held the answers. Against my better judgment, I returned to the clearing alone. The woods felt even more oppressive this time, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. When I reached the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing there, a woman in a white dress, her back to me. "Emily," I called out, though my voice felt small in the vast darkness. She turned slowly, and for a moment, I thought it was her. But the face staring back at me wasn't human. It was hollow, eyes like black voids, and a mouth twisted into a smile that didn't belong. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. The aftermath. I don't remember how I got back to the church. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, shaking uncontrollably. The clearing, the well, the figure, it all felt like a fever dream, but the scrap of fabric in my pocket told me otherwise. Emily was never found. The case went cold, but I couldn't let it go. The well, the journal, her final words, they haunted me. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear a voice calling my name. A whisper on the wind, faint but insistent. And I know it's her, or whatever she became. My name is Detective Elias Moore, and if you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing on the outskirts of an abandoned village, staring into the skeletal remains of a place lost to time, I would have laughed in your face. Yet, here I was, bracing against the chill of an October evening, drawn into a mystery that had consumed my every waking thought. It started innocuously enough. A report of strange activity in the area surrounding an old, long-abandoned settlement known as Black Hollow. Local hikers had reported hearing whispers in the trees, seeing lights flicker through the woods at night, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread the closer they ventured to the village. Most people dismissed the claims as overactive imaginations, urban legends that had been spun around the village's dark history. But when a local man disappeared without a trace while exploring Black Hollow, I couldn't ignore it. The village sat deep within a dense forest, its existence more rumor than reality. Maps didn't mark its location, and no official record of its history remained. What little I could dig up spoke of a thriving community that had mysteriously emptied overnight centuries ago, leaving behind only whispers of witchcraft, dark rituals, and a curse. The path to the village was overgrown, barely distinguishable from the rest of the forest floor. The trees grew closer together the farther I walked, their gnarled branches twisting like claws overhead, blocking out the fading sunlight. My boots crunched on dead leaves, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I pushed forward, my flashlight slicing through the gloom. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and every so often, I thought I heard footsteps that weren't my own. When I finally emerged into the clearing where the village once stood, the air seemed to shift. It was colder here, the kind of cold that burrowed deep into your bones. Black Hollow wasn't much to look at now, just the decaying remnants of what had once been homes and businesses. The wooden structures were rotting, leaning precariously as if the forest itself was trying to reclaim them. Vines snaked up the walls, and moss covered what remained of the cobblestone paths. But there was something about the place that made my skin crawl. It felt alive, as though the village was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I started with the largest building, what appeared to have been a church. Its steeple had collapsed, but the front door remained intact, hanging slightly ajar. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of unease. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something acrid and metallic. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the sound seemed deafening in the silence. At the front of the room stood an altar, its surface covered in strange carvings that I couldn't decipher. Behind it hung a faded tapestry depicting a group of hooded figures standing in a circle, their faces obscured. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but I couldn't make out the words. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but it was empty. The whisper came again, this time louder, and it seemed to be coming from outside. I stepped out into the clearing, and the whispering stopped. The forest was unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that made every nerve in my body scream to turn back. But I didn't. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I made my way deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they sounded like voices all around me. The trail led me to a clearing surrounded by ancient towering trees. In the center stood a stone circle, each stone etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of my flashlight. At the center of the circle was a pedestal, and on it lay an old, leather-bound book. I approached cautiously, every instinct telling me to turn back. The air felt electric, charged with a palpable sense of malice. The book was open to a page filled with symbols and diagrams that looked like instructions for a ritual. Beneath them was a passage written in spidery handwriting. To awaken the slumbering ones, offer blood and fire. The curse will bind, and the cycle will begin anew. As I read the words, the whispers rose to a deafening chorus, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. I spun around, my flashlight catching movement at the edge of the clearing. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms cloaked in darkness. Their faces were obscured by hoods, just like the figures in the tapestry. They didn't speak, but I could feel their eyes on me, their presence oppressive and unrelenting. One by one, they stepped into the circle, their movements slow and deliberate. The whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow even more unsettling. The tallest of the figures stepped forward and lowered their hood. Her face was pale, her eyes black as obsidian, and her lips twisted into a chilling smile. "You should not have come here," she said, her voice echoing as though it came from everywhere at once. Before I could react, she raised a hand, and I was thrown backward, my flashlight flying from my grip. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. "You seek answers," she said, stepping closer. "But some questions are better left unanswered." I struggled to my feet, my eyes darting between the figures as they began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I stumbled back toward the path, my heart pounding as the chant grew louder. The figures didn't follow, but their voices carried through the woods, haunting and relentless. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back toward the forest. The figures were gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I drove back to the station in silence, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The book, the figures, the curse, it all felt too surreal to be real. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing night. And then, there were the dreams. I saw the village, the stone circle, and the pale woman's face. But now, there was something else, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I tried to report what I had found, but the file on Black Hollow had disappeared from the system. It was as though the village and everything that had happened there had been erased. Now, I write this as a warning to anyone who might come across the name Black Hollow. Some places are meant to be forgotten. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried. And some curses never fade. Being a police officer in a small town has its quirks. Most days are spent handling disputes between neighbors, the occasional speeding ticket, and the rare burglary. But every so often, something happens that reminds you of the darker undercurrents lurking beneath even the quietest of communities. That night, I was on patrol. The streets were empty, bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. The radio crackled with static, a comforting sound on nights like these. The cemetery sat at the edge of town, a quiet expanse of weathered tombstones and ancient oaks that seemed to whisper in the wind. It wasn't unusual for me to drive past the cemetery on my rounds, but that night, something felt different. My headlights swept across the wrought iron gates, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the headstones. I slowed the car, rolling down the window to listen. The night was unnervingly silent. Even the usual hum of cicadas was absent. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel road. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. No response, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I might have chalked it up to my imagination if I hadn't seen the fresh mound of dirt near the center of the cemetery. I made my way through the rows of headstones, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The closer I got, the more certain I became. This grave was new. The soil was freshly turned, the edges sharp and clean, but there was no marker, no name or date to indicate who lay beneath. Kneeling down, I ran my fingers over the earth. It was soft and cold, and as I pressed my hand into the dirt, a strange chill ran up my spine. That's when I noticed it, a small object partially buried at the edge of the grave. I dug it out carefully, my gloves slick with mud. It was a key, old and rusted, attached to a faded leather tag with a single word etched into it. Room 6. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw something, just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow that vanished as soon as I turned. I returned to my patrol car and radioed the station. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. I'm at the old cemetery. I've found a freshly dug grave with no marker." The line crackled before a reply came through. "Copy that, Daniels. No burials scheduled there recently. You want backup?" I hesitated. "No, I'll handle it for now. But keep the line open." As I hung up, I noticed the faint glow of lights in the distance. The cemetery bordered an old motel that had been abandoned for years. Room 6. The key's tag had been clear, and something about it drew me to the dilapidated building. The motel was a relic of a bygone era, its peeling paint and broken neon sign a testament to years of neglect. I parked outside and approached cautiously. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a lobby covered in a thick layer of dust. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the halls. Room 6 was at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been waiting for me. "Police!" I called out, my voice firm. No answer. I pushed the door open with my flashlight, revealing a room frozen in time. The bed was neatly made. The nightstand held a vintage clock stopped at 3:15, and the walls were adorned with faded floral wallpaper. But it was the journal on the bed that caught my attention. The leather-bound journal was old, its edges frayed with age. I opened it carefully, the pages brittle beneath my fingers. The entries were written in a hurried scrawl, the ink smudged in places. "I don't know how much time I have left. He's coming for me. I can feel him watching even now. The cemetery. He told me to dig the grave. said it was the only way to make it stop. My heart raced as I read on. The entries grew more frantic, the writer describing a figure they couldn't escape, a man who appeared in their dreams, who whispered their name in the dead of night. The final entry was chillingly brief. If you're reading this, it's too late. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, though the air had been still moments before. A low creak sounded from the hallway, and I instinctively drew my weapon. "Who's there?" I demanded, stepping into the corridor. The shadows seemed to shift, closing in around me. I retraced my steps to the cemetery, my flashlight flickering as I approached the unmarked grave. The mound of dirt had changed. It looked disturbed, as if something, or someone, had been digging. My gut told me to leave, but my training kept me rooted. I radioed for backup, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. "Dispatch, I need units at the old cemetery ASAP. Something's not right." As I waited, I noticed something sticking out of the dirt, a piece of fabric. I pulled it free, revealing a torn shirt that matched a missing persons report I'd seen weeks earlier. The pieces began to fall into place. The grave, the journal, the abandoned motel. As I stood by the unmarked grave, the quiet unease of the night became a deafening roar in my mind. The fabric I'd pulled from the soil was unmistakably tied to the missing persons case, a young man who had vanished without a trace. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of wind, carrying with it a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I stumbled back, gripping my flashlight tightly. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, shaking the nearby headstones. My breath caught in my throat as the mound of dirt began to shift, slowly at first, then violently, as if something was trying to break free. But before I could process it, I heard a sound that froze me in place, the faint sound of breathing coming from the grave. I stepped back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The breathing grew louder, more labored, until it was accompanied by a voice, a low, raspy whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." "Stop!" I shouted into the darkness, though I wasn't sure who or what I was addressing. I don't remember running back to my car, but I remember the feeling of my chest burning as I gasped for air. By the time backup arrived, the grave had disappeared. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, as though it was all a dream, the key in my pocket, the only proof that anything had been there at all. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I couldn't. I try to avoid driving by the old cemetery because when I do, I feel the weight of unseen eyes. And now, whenever I close my eyes, I see the unmarked grave in the darkness, waiting patiently for my return.